Welcome, friends, to a presentation on Against the Current, Father Tom Oddo and the New American Catholic. I am Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, which is co-hosting tonight's program along with New Ways Ministry. LGBTQ is a unique venture dedicated to preserving the history of LGBTQ religious movements around the world. LGBTQ is a digital enterprise. We are not a physical repository that stores papers. We advise and support leaders and groups in their efforts to preserve their records in appropriate archives. Furthermore, we collect and provide a treasure of historical information on our website about LGBTQ plus persons and groups from a wide array of religious expressions around the world. And finally, we encourage research and scholarship in queer religious history. Now, here is a word of welcome from our co-host, New Ways Ministry.
Oh, yes. Hi, I'm Sister Janine Gramick, and I'm a co-founder of New Ways Ministry. New Ways Ministry is a Catholic organization that seeks justice and reconciliation for LGBTQ plus people. For the last 49 years, so we're pretty old, for the last 49 years, we've conducted in-person and online programs, mainly in the US, but also in other parts of the English-speaking world. You may have heard about us because we gained much attention, at least in the Catholic community, after our staff met with Pope Francis in 2023 and again in 2024. So we have not yet met Pope Leo, but we're working on it. But tonight, we're going to hear from Tyler Bieber about his biography of Father Tom Oddo. Tom was an early leader of Dignity USA and a very key figure in the struggle for LGBTQ rights in the Catholic Church. I knew Tom, and I collaborated with him in the early 1970s when he was the National Secretary of Dignity. The early 70s and the early 1980s were spectacular times in the Catholic Church. We were filled with excitement, the excitement of the Second Vatican Council. Priests and nuns were speaking out on a host of social justice issues. In many ways, the United States Catholic hierarchy and religious institutions, such as the one that I belong to now, Sisters of Loretto, we made public statements supporting gay and lesbian people. That's as much as we knew at the time. The community at that time was not aware of the gender spectrum. But the hierarchy and religious communities were really well ahead of the laity at that point. And Dignity and New Ways Ministry, we began to educate the laity. And Father Tom Oddo, Father Bob Nugent, who was a co-founder with me at New Ways Ministry, and we all collaborated on a number of adventures or issues. One was an educational booklet called Homosexual Catholics, a New Primer for Discussion. I remember Tom. He was an extremely gifted individual, extremely smart, but not off-putting, as some smart people can be. He put you at ease. He was able to bring out the best in people. And he was very astute, very diplomatic. He made connections with the institutional church. He was able to get Dignity invited to the Bishops' Conference, the bishops that celebrated the U.S. bicentennial in 1976. Dignity had a representative because of his determination and his knowing how to work in the established religious structures. So he was able to get Dignity invited to that celebration. So I wasn't really surprised, although disappointed for Dignity, but I wasn't surprised when his community then tapped him to become president of the University of Portland in 1982. He was the president who was convicted in a car accident in 1989. And as we will hear tonight, much more from Tyler Bieber as he draws an intimate picture of Father Tom Oddo. From interviews, personal archives, and overlooked documents, Tyler will give us a very compelling story. It's a story about a very courageous leader, an activist, I would say a holy man, who lived within the confines of our tradition and yet embodied hope, resilience, and a new vision of Catholicism. So we are in for a treat tonight.
Thank you so much, Janine. The moderator of tonight's discussion is Maxwell Kuzma, a writer, host of the Whiplash podcast, and an advocate for LGBTQ inclusion in the Catholic Church. Max is a columnist for the National Catholic Reporter, board member of Dignity USA, and has been interviewed by national media on issues related to transgender identity within Catholicism. Max lives in a hobby farm in Ohio with his partner. Author Tyler Bieber is a queer higher education professional based in Portland, Oregon. Tyler is currently the assistant registrar at Willamette University's Pacific Northwest College of Art. He holds a BA in Liberal Arts and Sciences from the Evergreen State College and an MA in Higher Education and Student Affairs from the University of Portland. To those of you watching this webinar, we welcome your comments or questions in the chat box or the Q&A function. The presenters will respond to those during a Q&A time toward the end of tonight's program. If you would like to offer personal greetings or comments to the presenters, stay here after the webinar has concluded and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. Please direct any technical concerns to Joe Ward, who is the tech manager for this program. Now, finally, I am pleased to welcome Max and Tyler to begin this conversation.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you, Sister Janine, as well, for providing that really important and very interesting experiences that you had knowing Father Tom personally. I'm so glad that you are here and were able to share that with all of us. So, and thank you to all of you who have joined us tonight. And thank you to the LGBTQ Religious Archive Network itself for hosting this conversation. So as everyone has said, we're here to celebrate and explore Tyler Bieber's wonderful new book, Against the Current, Father Tom Oddo and the New American Catholic. And I also was instructed to remind you to get those questions in so that I can collect them as we go. And during the Q&A portion, which will be after our 30-minute interview here, I will, bring those up. So please put them in so that I can do my part of the job too. And finally, before we begin, I also would like to encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Tyler's book, whether you're interested in LGBTQ history, Catholic history, higher education, or simply the story of this extraordinary priest whose witness still resonates today. I think you'll find it to be a thoughtful and deeply researched read. So yes, let us begin. Tyler, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Max. And thank you, everybody who's been involved with this webinar. It's a whole team of folks who have put this together. Mark, Sister Janine, Joe, the Religious Archives Network. It's fabulous to be here. And thank you all for being here too. It's an honor.
Wonderful. So before we dive into your research specifically about Father Tom, I'd love to begin with you. So you're a higher educational professional, not necessarily a professional historian by training. So what
Right.
first drew you to Tom's story? And at what point did you realize this wasn't just an interesting historical figure, but someone whose life deserved a full-length biography? And what convinced you to write that?
Yeah, so you're right. I'm not a historian by trade, but I'm also not necessarily a writer by training. I am, however, somebody that likes to write. I've written for years now, but never have really dove into nonfiction. I got the idea of writing a book about college presidents in the Pacific Northwest around 2022, 2023. And as I was doing research for that book, I was getting background information on the history of the University of Portland. And I came across a really great book by James T. Connolly, which was a full history of the university's first 100 years from 1901 to 2001. That book had a chapter that was about the 1980s in the university's history. And much of that chapter, as people will know from reading my book, is basically the Tom Oddo decade at UP. He was president from 1982 to 1989. And so the chapter focused a lot on his accomplishments as president, but also his contributions to the university's Catholic character. A big focus of the chapter was on his efforts to kind of renew the focus of Catholicism at UP, which had been on a bit of a drift at that point. And so the more I read about him, the more fascinated I was, particularly about the point that he had ministered to gay and lesbian Catholics in the 1970s prior to his service as president. Not only had I never heard of him before, even though my building that I took classes in was literally next to the Memorial Plaza named after him, never heard his name before. And the more I learned about him, the more I wanted to understand, the more information I wanted to find. And at a certain point, you just hit a wall of the amount of established resources that are out there. So I took a weekend to really think about what my next project was for writing, since the College President's book didn't end up getting published. It was not picked up by a publisher. And then I decided, this story is so interesting. There's so much here. There has to be a very compelling life story that should be uncovered, that really needs to be explored. And I took it upon myself to start reaching out to people. Father Jeff Schneibel at the University of Portland's archive was one of the first people I talked to. And from those very early conversations, it was clear to me from conversations with him and with other people at UP, this was a story that should be told. And there were plenty of people that had their own contributions to that story. So it was from a very early point in my research, I was sold. This is a book that is worth pursuing. This is a book worth writing. And yeah, here we are 3 years later.
And I know as well that you had a really interesting process of finding some of those materials, like through the archive process itself. So I'm
Mhm.
curious about, particular letters, speeches, photographs, or even personal interviews where you spoke to people who knew Tom, and how did those experiences impact you? Or was there a moment in all of this where something just finally clicked and you had a deeper understanding of Tom's life?
Mhm. So I had a ton of research that I had to do for this book, not just to cover Tom's university presidency, but also for his activist years. And those were years that were not, I think, as accessible to me in terms of research material. The University of Portland has a fantastic archive, and they have a wonderful digital archive open to the public that has a trove of articles from the Beacon, which is the student newspaper at the University of Portland. Fabulous work done by years of student journalists, some of whom became professional journalists after their stint at the Beacon. So award-winning work done by these students. I would have been lost on the university history if I didn't have access to those issues of the student newspaper and if the archive was not nearly as organized as it is. So I really give kudos to the university for keeping it that way. Similarly, with the archive and physical material, Father Schneibel was very forthcoming as the university archivist to allow me access to things that people had not seen since they had basically been boxed up and put in the archive after Tom passed away in 1989. At one point, there was an archival project to try and determine what was left over, but really some of these things had not been seen for many years. And some of that involved handwritten speeches by Tom, the big looping cursive letters of Tom's handwriting. It's fascinating to see some of the things that were kept from both his time as president and from prior to his presidency in these different places. But I think most importantly were the personal interviews that I had with people. And people were very giving of their time. Father Richard Berg, who was Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, he was my first interview, September of 2023. So we are actually almost 3 years ago now from this interview. And that very first interview, I remember thinking that this is a person that really stuck with him. This is a person that he not only worked with, but he really admired. Because the first question that I asked Father Dick, is, what words would you use to describe Father Tom? And he said, Father Tom is my friend, not was, is my friend, present tense, because he said he prays and talks to Tom all the time, even now. He's a confidant even now. It's a friend for life, even past his own life. That's the kind of connection people have with Tom. So I had conversations with people that work with him at University of Portland. I had conversations with Ed Oddo, his cousin and sort of surrogate brother from New York. I had conversations with people that, had interactions with him between his youth and the university. So really a wide variety of conversations, including one conversation between Jeremy and Norman Countryman, who were father-son, and unfortunately involved in the car accident with Tom that led to his death. That was a conversation that they had never had together. And I'm very honored that we got to have that, the three of us together. The fact that people were willing to give hours of their time talking about Tom and their recollections of him just really speaks a lot to the connection that he had with those people, but also the connection I have to his story. It's been fascinating to hear their recollections. So between all of these sources, I mean, it did take several years to kind of pull it all together and bring together a picture of who he was, especially given how complex of a person he was too.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. I wanted to ask about that partially because, in a nerdy way, I think it is really cool that you got to do all that archival research. I think that's just so excellent, but also because I think it will really help people to appreciate the depth of information in the book. We only have so much time here in this conversation, and I really wanted to encourage people. Yeah, Tyler went hard. There's a lot here to really, really get into. But for my next question, Tom had all these different roles, the university president, the role and leadership that he had in Dignity. He was just kind of a very remarkably influential and charismatic priest and person himself. But also, not many people have heard of him. So, can you kind of walk the line a little bit here, like kind of give us a little bit of that overview of like some of those accomplishments, but then also kind of talk about how your understanding of him developed as you learned about these different roles that he had, and basically by the end of your research, had your understanding of who he was fundamentally changed in some way. That's kind of the arc I'm looking for.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So when I was thinking about like how to approach this story from the very beginning, I was thinking this is a remarkable, probably unsung figure in gay history, in the history of the gay liberation movement, just by itself in the US. I think that he is an unsung figure, an unsung hero. But starting out, I had to contend with the fact he was this major activist, but yes, I had not heard much about him. By the end of it, I realized that's exactly how he would have wanted it, because he was the kind of person who would be a very reluctant, and yet, actually, reluctant's the wrong word. He would be reluctant to take credit, I think. He would be reluctant to be at the head of the crowd. He would much rather be in the back, walking with everybody else, with the rest of his people, and be kind of the nameless person pushing from behind the scenes. When I started the research, I expected to see somebody, akin to a Harvey Milk, who very important, very public facing, very recognizable face in the movement. What I came to find was that because Tom was not open about his sexuality, although he was a gay man, he was not open about his sexuality. That meant that he had a bit of plausible deniability, maybe the wrong way to put it, but there was at least a semblance of there was a vagueness about it where it wasn't talked about. If you were a priest, your sexuality just was not a public question and it was not up for public discussion. And so it gave him kind of the perfect way to approach these issues from a place of prominence in American society. I mean, we have to remember that in the 60s and the 70s, the fact that Second Vatican Council was so impactful on the American church was because the American church was so big and so many people belonged to it and were so faithful to it that it was such a huge shift in the way that the liturgy was practiced. So, he had to be sort of strategic about how he operated. Not only did he had to keep his sexuality secret for fear of losing his position, for fear of being kicked out of his church, he also had to be strategic about the kinds of things he was aiming to do. The things that he did, he spoke out in favor of anti-discrimination legislation in Massachusetts that was destined to fail, and yet he was still on record as a priest speaking out in favor of it. He was a champion of Elaine Noble, who ran for state legislature in 1974 in Massachusetts, won her primary by under 170 votes, and became the first openly gay elected legislator in American history 4 years before Harvey Milk was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. So he is key to the electoral victory of the very first openly gay legislator in our country's history. People don't know about that. He was part of the National Gay Rights Lobby. He was there at the National Lesbian Gay March on DC in 1979. He was integral to the founding of Dignity USA, which is still operating today, and he was its first national secretary. So in those very early fledgling years where the entire slate of board officers were Boston-based, again, because of Tom, you saw the growth in membership, the growth in influence over the course of the 70s of Dignity's kind of outsized efforts in the church, really punching above its weight class as a civil rights organization, changing minds among clergy, changing minds among American bishops, even some of the most conservative people that might have been the most vocally against the Second Vatican Council, suddenly giving it some space and some airtime within, discussions within the church. So he was a very influential figure, and I think it was largely because he operated so strategically. He was almost, as I've kind of come to realize, chameleonic in the way that he dealt with church politics, the way he dealt with American domestic politics, and yet he never lost face. He never lost a position because of the things that he said, even when they contradicted the Archdiocese of Boston, and the Archdiocese had to walk comments that he made back. He just knew where the walls were in the institution, and he knew how to use those to his advantage. And I think it shows in both the growth and Dignity and its influence while he was part of the board, as well as his efforts to change the political sphere, or the political atmosphere of the United States, primarily with the Elaine Noble campaign, but also in his work with anti-discrimination legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of leads me to maybe more of like internal or his own spirituality question, because I know that as you talk about in the book as well, he had always wanted to be a priest. And so the question I have, though, is one thing that struck me through the book is he never really seemed interested in having to choose between being the faithful priest or being an advocate. He saw them as, connected, or like that was, how he wanted to be. So as you came to know him through your research, what do you think enabled him to live so comfortably in that tension? I also think of, I think it was his thesis for Harvard, the thesis that is the monk and the activist. So
That's
maybe
right.
bringing in some of that too.
Yeah, so he wrote a dissertation as part of his doctoral program at Harvard, published in 1979, as Max said, called The Monk and the Activist. It's about Fathers Merton and Berrigan, who at that time, very polar opposite ways of approaching the priestly life. Father Berrigan ended up on the FBI's most wanted list because he was burning draft cards and he was protesting the Vietnam War. Father Merton, meanwhile, wrote over 20 books, and he wrote largely about inward-looking spirituality. He talked a lot about connection with God. He was a very noted monk, I believe a Benedictine monk, if I remember correctly. But Tom revered both individuals. He felt that both had something to contribute to the larger conversation of how do you effectively work as a priest in 1970s America. He saw them both to be kind of one half of the same coin, one side, the same coin, or two sides of the same coin, rather. And he felt, I think, that they represented one half of what a good priest should be. So it's not that priests should always be vocal activists, and it's not always that they should be inward-looking monks. It's that they should have characteristics of both that complement their work, and that they are not necessarily opposed to one another. And I think it speaks to his orientation towards that kind of approach, just to how to be a priest, that he both spent so much time thinking about what does it mean to be a gay Catholic, and what is the liturgy, what is the Bible, what does our church say about this, and what can we say about this, while also, taking a stand and actually being a vocal advocate for change. I think that both were really necessary to be successful, and I think that was the reason he was able to make kind of that bridge between those types of priests.
Yeah, and if you could say maybe just a little bit more about just about your reflections on his spirituality from reading the speeches or the things that he gave, and knowing those details, like how he always wanted to be a priest. Could you just say a little bit about what his faith meant to him?
Yeah. So he was raised Catholic. His family was very much a Catholic family from Sicily. And so there was a large tradition of Catholicism in his family. It was very much that everyone was raised Catholic. That was just the family tradition. But when he was growing up, he really respected and admired the Holy Cross brothers that he grew up around, that taught him, that were administering the schools that he went to. He really felt that they had a special position in society, that helped people, that could advocate for people, that could make change happen within communities, and that could bring people to kind of an understanding of themselves. Because he talked about, the issues that gay Catholics go through with their identity and reconciling that with their faith. That was core to his message about how it's not a one or the other proposition. You can be a gay person who has, attractions to the same sex, attractions that are non-traditional, you could say, in a church context. And you can be a practicing Catholic, and they are not opposed to one another. Those identities are not at war with one another. And that by itself was a radical notion at that time. I see somebody mentioned that Father Merton was a Trappist, not a Benedictine. Important note to make. So thank you. That I think that he felt that if he was a priest that could relate to people, that could understand where they were coming from at that time, he could make a difference, and that was his calling. From a very early age, from 7, 8, 9 years old, that was what he wanted to do. He never strayed from wanting to do that. It was always his calling. So I think that his spirituality, his religion, was definitely core to that. I don't think he would have done anything else with his life based off of my research and based off of what people have told me about him. That was how deep his spirituality was.
Perfect. Thank you so much for answering that one. The next question I have for you is, sometimes people speak about LGBTQ inclusion in Christianity as though it's kind of a brand new conversation. But Tom's life definitely reminds us that there were faithful Catholics advocating for LGBTQ dignity for many decades. So could you give us some examples of the ways Tom's advocacy stands out to you? And how did writing this book kind of change your understanding of the continuity of this movement? Kind of this idea that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes.
So I think Tom's work stands out because it was kind of the first moment when there was a collective understanding, a national understanding, maybe a small but growing understanding of gay liberation, what it meant to be a gay person. There was sort of this window of opportunity after the Second Vatican Council for priests to talk about the church in new ways, in new contexts, for traditions to potentially change or be modified or be updated to the times, basically for the church to be more representative of its own communities. And what that looked like, at least for Tom, for people in the United States, was, I'm gay, I'm Catholic, I feel like I should be comfortable going to church. A very just simple notion nowadays, but back then, again, very radical. That was around the same time when you had the first national organized gay rights movement events, like gay pride parades. When Stonewall happened in 1969, the next year there was the Christopher Street Liberation Parade. That was the very first gay rights parade. It was held in New York. And then by 1974, you had the first nationally coordinated pride event. And in 1974 specifically, that was the very first year that that had happened. New York was kind of the epicenter of that national coordination. Tom was walking that parade route. There is footage of him walking that parade route in his collar with other priests, with dignity officers, with banners saying, that God loves me, even though I'm gay, talking about the dignity of gay Catholics. He was front and center at the exact right time, I think, because there was this, again, a building national understanding about gay issues, about being gay and being Catholic and what that meant to be both. And also media exposure at a time when you had not seen that sort of exposure nationwide in our media sphere. And then going into the late 70s, you just saw that grow. Even though there was no internet at that time, we were very far away from internet connectivity. You see Tom appear in newspapers all over the country in the 1970s and even into the 1980s as a dignity officer. You see him appear on the East Coast as a subject matter expert. He's traveling to other countries and appearing in their newspapers. In one newspaper in Sydney in 1975, there is a snippet that says that priests that are associated with these movements here, they basically live in fear and will not identify themselves. And that same writer said in the very next sentence, that is not the case in America because of people like Father Tom Oddo, who lead dignity and movements like it. So I think he was a very courageous individual who hit the exact right moment, where prior to that, you have movements that sprout up that are very regional or that are very secretive by nature of their members and by their professions, by their reputations. You also just did not have the media exposure or interest in those kinds of stories until you get into the 1970s. In addition to the Second Vatican Council happening right around that same time, it was really a perfect opportunity, I think, for someone like Tom, people like him, to come along and say, hey, maybe we should rethink this. Maybe we need to have a different conversation about the church and gay people. And so I think that's why he was much more effective than others before him, even though there were many before him that were saying the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, it's interesting because then he has this shift into the university president years. And I think it's interesting to see how, from my understanding of him, from having read your book, I see him as definitely keeping the same passion and kind of funneling it into maybe it was funneled into the conversations he was having on campus with, it sounds like everybody he could meet, even the housekeepers. They were having a hard time finding him for like professional meetings because he was too busy talking to everybody. So he had that element going on. And then also in the university years, kind of teaching various classes. So about sexuality. So I would love if you could kind of maybe transition us into those years and kind of how his life changed and some of the different things that he was doing that still maintain some of that energy and passion from those exciting years you just described into this different role that is, kind of a different realm, the academic realm instead of the advocacy realm.
So I think Tom always looked at advocacy as a function of education. It's a function of teaching. The Holy Cross congregation is all about education, and that is central to their mission, core to their mission. So I think Tom, in that respect, very much a Holy Cross priest, that he jumped at the opportunity to teach a class about human sexuality, and he taught a version of his human sexuality class for many years, including into his university presidency. It's actually towards the end of his presidency that he started going back to teaching classes. He was not able to those first couple of years, but towards the end, he said, I need to get back in the classroom. That was his calling, was being a teacher, being an educator. And I think that he approached his advocacy in sort of the same way. He's educating people about a topic that he recognizes if they have prejudices or if they're bringing prejudice to the table, it's because they don't have education. And you can't basically be a prejudiced individual if you are educated about your other fellow human beings. That's, I think, his approach, or that was his thinking. So when he came into a teaching role at Stonehill College in Boston initially in 1974, I think that was his calling. He wanted to be a faculty member the rest of his career if he could have been. He was a faculty chair for a year, an acting chair. That was his only administrative experience in a college before he became president at University of Portland. He had almost no experience going into that role of that caliber of leadership. And yet he jumped at the opportunity. He was asked, I think, very politely, sort of desperately by someone in the Holy Cross congregation, Father Richard Warner, please apply for this job. We think you would be great for it. When he was picked for that job, I think he realized, I have an opportunity to educate. I have an opportunity to expand on what I've already been doing at Stonehill. And I think that's what kept him in that role. I think he would have stayed the president of UP as long as he could have had he lived past 1989, because I think he was really drawn to educating people. He saw his advocacy translated in the classroom, I think. And so the dignity advocacy became less and less of his career into his presidency. He did attend a dignity event in 1983 as president. I know that he did go to dignity events early on in his presidency while he was officially president of UP, but it was less of a focus in his later career. I think it is because his focus too changed. I want to now be the educator in the classroom rather than the educator in the legislative chambers, or the educator in the community center, or the educator out on the streets in the protest. I think he saw that this was the next chapter of his work. And so I think that's really part of what motivated him to the classroom. But honestly, I think he was always meant to be a teacher. And I think that he really found himself at home there.
Wonderful answer. Thank you, Tyler. So, kind of again with this question about like how he did all these different things, I kind of want to bring it back to you again and kind of your perspective after you spent so much time researching his life. So, I guess two questions here. What aspect of him do you think that history has overlooked? And what do you most hope readers come away understanding that they probably wouldn't have known before reading your book?
Those are good questions. I think that in terms of what he's been overlooked as, I think he is an early pivotal figure in the gay liberation movement and the gay rights movement. He is unsung because he was not able to live openly in his time. I think that if he was identified as an openly gay priest at that time, he would have lost his position. I think he would have had an uphill battle. I don't know that he would have been as successful. And I think that that's very tragic and a very sad reflection on American history that that is the case. And I think that's all the more important reason why we need to be telling his story now. He was an incredibly important person at a very critical time for a fledgling movement to really gain traction, and to gain traction among people that would not be easily swayed otherwise, who would not be the most logical of allies. Engaging with audiences of people that had grown up in the pre-Vatican Church that was very insular, very closed to these kinds of ideas like gay rights, and people being gay because they were made that way, because God made them that way. So I think that in the overall arc of gay history and the gay rights movement in the United States, I think very pivotal early figure that is now largely overlooked because he was not able to live openly. Can you repeat the second question just so I can address it?
Yes. What are you hoping that, I mean, honestly, you kind of answered it, because it was, what are you hoping that readers come away understanding they wouldn't have known? So you're kind of,
Sure.
Maybe you're kind of already answering both of those. As we get,
Well,
yeah,
I do,
okay, go
I
ahead.
do want to just add in one last thing, maybe, about that. So the thing I hope people come away with is that Tom was just another person. Tom, as remarkable as he was, as eloquent, well-spoken, strategic, smart, in the right place, and sort of lucky as he was, he's just a person. But without his efforts, I mean, I think anyone that I've talked to, anyone that knew him would tell you, the university would be worse off. The gay rights movement probably would have been, not as vocal in the right spaces. People would not have come into the dignity fold that did, and probably needed to for their own livelihoods. I can't tell you how many people he probably had really tough conversations with in confessional just at the University of Portland. I mean, you just think about the kind of conversations he must have had with students who may have been struggling with their sexuality too. Like, he was just a person, and he did so much important stuff that largely would go unrecognized now if we didn't have this book, if we didn't have this research. I want people to come away from this story hearing that I can be the person in a situation. I can be the advocate for someone. I can do these things because Tom could. He was just another person. These movements for civil rights, our efforts to try and equalize, our efforts to try and bring equality both in the law and within the church, those rely on the efforts of ordinary people like Tom, like you and me, like people in the Dignity Fold, like New Ways Ministry. I mean, they rely on so many people, and without those efforts continuing, the fight is lost. And I think that was really experienced in the 1980s after Tom had left the board. You saw a huge reflexive clawback of a lot of the progress that Dignity made in the 70s. And it speaks to the fact that the fight is never really over. We need to keep going, but it's because of ordinary people, not because of superheroes. So I think, if anything, I want people to know that Tom was very much a human, but he was an extraordinary human. And I think he's inspiring me and other people to be extraordinary humans too.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Tyler. Before we kind of get into some of these Q&As, I wondered if you could also let people know about the audiobook that is
Yes.
in development right now.
Yes. So we are currently running a Kickstarter campaign to produce the audiobook for Against the Current, which is very exciting. What's also very exciting to report is that we have met our minimum goal, and so we are going to be producing it. We are in the last couple days of the campaign. It ends on July 27th. Right now, what is great is if you pledge at the $15 level or more, you're basically reserving a copy of the audiobook for yourself. So if people are interested, if you feel so inclined, you can use the QR code that's now on the screen. You can pledge at whatever level you're comfortable at, but there is some great stuff that you can add on as well at different levels. That's produced by Unencumbered Press. That's my publisher, publisher of this book and several other great pieces. So if you're so inclined, please use this QR code, pledge at whatever level you're comfortable at. Like I said, the campaign ends on July 27th. Production will start very soon after that, and we're expecting to release this sometime this fall. So even if you do not pledge, even if it's just telling your friends that this is happening, know that it is coming this fall, and it's going to be, I think, really great. I'm really excited about it. So any support,
Awesome.
we really appreciate it.
And I'm a supporter of that Kickstarter too, because I'm excited about
Yes.
that.
Yes. And thank
So
you.
now, yeah, absolutely. So now let's turn to some of these Q&As. One big question that I'm seeing here is, do we know what kind of gay texts and publications Father Tom himself read, if any? Was he reading
Mhm.
liberationist newspapers, for example? Was he
Mhm.
reading liberation theology? What informed his own liberationist activism? Sounds like Berrigan is a big one. If teaching sexuality, was he teaching sexologists? So kind of a lot there, but yeah.
Yeah, so he was teaching not only Berrigan, he was also teaching a few sexologists. There was one book, I believe it was called The Front Runner, that he taught very frequently in his sexuality courses. And so he was not only teaching theology, he was also teaching human sexuality texts. He was looking at texts that were produced by people in the Dignity Fold. And so Father John McNeil was a big influence, I think, and peer at that time. Another person that came up very frequently, I believe his name was John Bostwick, who was a historian in Massachusetts in the Boston area. Kind of a younger but very influential figure, I think also an overlooked figure in American history, talking about the history of gay relationships and of gay sexuality through the centuries, not just in contemporary days, but also looking at homosexuality through multiple centuries and through different contexts in that respect. So he was teaching not only off of these different theologies, Berrigan among them, also people that were talking about sexuality, sexologists of that nature, and of gay historians, people that were not only in his fold, in his circle, but also people that were, in different parts of the United States, different parts of the world. He frequently cites different texts in his speeches. And so that he was drawing from a multitude of different sources when he was teaching and when he was giving his homilies.
Perfect. And kind of related to that, do you know if any outlines of his human sexuality class still exist?
I believe some might. I have not seen them myself, but I know there are some materials that are held by the University of Portland Archive. If they did exist, they most likely would be there. I have not gotten any from Stonehill, which would be the other place that would probably have them on hand. So if they do exist, they are somewhere in the UP archive.
Perfect. And then there's kind of a few questions kind of about Father Tom's own sexuality. I think the
Mhm.
question is really one way the question was worded was, since Tom was basically an advocate for gay inclusion but not openly gay, how did you learn he was gay? So I think
Mhm.
some curiosity there, and curiosity about his commitment to celibacy as a priest and religious. So maybe anything that you know
Yeah.
about in that realm.
So it's a good question. I was actually just looking through my notes. I was doing a project looking through all of my research material, and I came across my recollection. I made some audio recollections of interviews that I did immediately afterwards, just summarizing my thoughts. One of them was after the interview that I had with Father Berg. That was the very first interview that I had. One of the things that he shared with me, sort of in closing of this interview, which had already been, I feel like, a very good conversation, he mentioned, I hope you know this. I don't know if you do. Father Tom had a romantic partner who was here in Portland when he was president. He did not know the person's name. I did not ask it, but immediately I thought, this is fascinating. There is a larger human story here that has clearly not been told, and should not have been told in that time for obvious reasons. But from that moment, I was like, there is so much more here that is worth looking into. From that conversation on, something that I would bring up to certain interview subjects was, did you know that Tom was gay? Was Tom gay? Some variation of that. It was largely known among most of my interview subjects, and it was also never a conversation that they had with him in person. It was something that was just a known entity that no one discussed, which I thought was fascinating because it meant a certain segment of his world knew intimately, and that a certain segment, a large segment, did not, or most likely had no clue. But the fact is that by the end of my research, I had at least three different people I had interviewed and talked to who confirmed not only was Tom closeted gay man, he also had a long-term romantic relationship with a man. His name was Paul Dietrich, and he was a co-founder of Dignity Boston. He was president of Dignity Boston and eventually became president of Dignity USA. He was the first national president of the organization. If I recall correctly, he was on the board with Tom. Very impactful duo working together, but they were also in this secret relationship. And that relationship continued until Tom was president of University of Portland, continued into his service at the University of Portland. How it ended, I'm not sure. And there are some fuzzy details around when it started, when it ended. But what we do know is that they were partners. They did have a romantic partnership. They were together. It is a difficult thing for me to think about Tom and his vows. He did take vows as a priest. Every priest does. In his vows, he would have taken a vow of chastity. I have no doubt about that. And so to me, I do think, there is some tough reconciliation there, being a priest that lives up to your vows and also potentially being a gay person. But he himself was the very first person to say, you don't necessarily have to be in an active sexual relationship to be a good Catholic and to be gay in the church. He believed that people can have responsible gay relationships that did not center around the sexual aspect. I have to assume that there was something to that in his relationships just by nature of how people are as human beings. And I don't think he thought it was an impediment on his work and necessarily an impediment on what he believed or or that it was in some way in conflict with what he believed. I think that him being in a long-term romantic relationship, if anything, was proof to him that being gay and being Catholic are not irreconcilable. In fact, they can be very lovingly complementary of one another.
Absolutely. There's like not that much time, so I'm trying to like get as many questions. So I'm gonna kind of combine three questions here because I think they're kind of connected, but they are distinct. So, was
Sure.
Tom advocating for a change in church doctrine? And then this one's a little bit specific. Did he refer much to the revision of the APA's position on the pathology of homosexuality in 1973?
Mhm.
And then
Mhm.
finally, this questioner acknowledges that you deal with this in the book, but they're wondering how in the 1980s, as AIDS became the dominant issue of the time, how that impacted Father Tom's work. So if you need a reminder, I can tell you again, but they seem kind of connected there.
Yeah. So first one, really quick, one more time. First one.
Was he advocating for a change in church doctrine?
Right. So he, I think, was advocating for a change in basically the liturgy and how church was practiced, but not necessarily in church custom. And so he's not saying get rid of the Eucharist, get rid of, this major piece. He was saying, here's who should participate in the Eucharist. Let's open it to new people. Let's open it to everybody. Just in the same way that Vatican II did not necessarily change how the church operated from a textual level, it did change the way the church operated on a practical level. And so I think that was more of what his sense was. He was not somebody out on the street saying that gay people should have the right to marry necessarily, or even that women should be able to be ordained, which was another issue that came up very frequently in dignity circles. And the reason why, he said basically they couldn't break too many rules. They couldn't rock too many boats at any one given time. And so he was not advocating for a major change in church custom. And yet he was advocating for a change in the way the church oriented itself to its parishioners. And so I think that's the most elegant way that I can say it. It is also speaking to his way of kind of threading the needle that he had to do for the work that he did. The second question.
The second one is, did he refer much to the revision of the APA's position on the pathology of homosexuality in 1973?
And yes, he did. So that report with the APA did come up at least once that I read in his work, in his writings. And he did do several writings through the 70s into the early 80s about specifically pastoral issues. That was something that came up. The APA's decision in 1973 was a landmark decision. That influenced a lot of people, a lot of thought leaders, I think including Tom, that here is even more evidence that what I am saying has some scientific backing to it. It's not only that I am speaking from my personal experience, though I can't say that out loud, it's also speaking to what the research is saying. So I think that led some real credence to what he was working towards. And I know that the third one was about how AIDS influenced his work into the 80s. So it very much did. By the 1980s, you saw kind of the effects of AIDS sneaking into his university presidency. In 1986, the University of Portland hosted the social dimensions of AIDS. I believe that's what the workshop was called. There was a workshop that was done, a panel discussion that was done with campus ministry, the health center, as well as a man living openly with AIDS in Portland that talked very freely about gay issues. Tom was the moderator of that panel, and it was the first of several events that the university coordinated to specifically talk about AIDS in a factual representation and basically attack misinformation directly, because there was rampant misinformation at that time, even among university campus folks. By 1989, you not only had multiple events that had been done on campus, but Tom also used his position as university president to produce a health pamphlet specifically about the realities of AIDS and to try and combat misinformation that was then mailed to everybody at the university in fall of 1987. That was him putting institutional money, resources, time, and effort into combating the misinformation about AIDS that then translated into policies that were adopted by the health center at the university where, for example, they never tested for AIDS status for the admission of students while other universities considered that. They handled AIDS testing in the health center. They treated students who were testing positive as any other human being. That by itself, I think, was a major step forward by a university, especially a Catholic one at that time, when people were afraid to shake hands with AIDS patients for fear of catching it themselves. So I think that he not only took on the challenge of AIDS as a disease, he took on the challenge of AIDS as a disease of misinformation. And he used his post as a university president and as an educator to try and combat those things. So I think AIDS was a huge focus of his late presidency. I think that he was the perfect person to really address that topic in his role. I really do.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Tyler. I know I had many questions for you, and then I hit you with a bunch of questions. For everybody who has joined us, we will have some more time for questions, but before we do that, I am going to hand it back to Mark and Sister Janine, who are going to, formally complete the webinar, and then again, we will have some additional time after. So if you have something pressing, stick around. And thank you once again, Tyler, for your work on this book and for a great evening this evening.
Thank you, Max. And thank you everyone again for being here. This was fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tyler and Max, for that fast-flowing, inspiring, and fascinating program. And thanks to all of you who participated and offered so many comments and questions. Within a few days, you will all receive an email with a link to a recording of tonight's program that you can share with family and friends. If you're interested in more opportunities to explore the history of LGBTQ religious movements, check out the LGBTQ website, and particularly our events page. There you will find announcements of future online programs, as well as recordings of past presentations. We are taking a break for the month of August and will not present a webinar. However, I do want to give you the date of Sunday, October 18th, which is LGBTQ RAN's annual online gala. You don't want to miss this festive celebration of some key leaders of LGBTQ religious movements and 25 years of LGBTQ RAN. Watch for more details to come. Janine?
Yes. Oh, well, thank you. Well, New Ways Ministry has some upcoming events too. I'd just like to tell you about one of them. The most recent one that's coming up is going to be an in-person retreat for LGBTQ people and friends. And it'll be in September, the beginning, well, sort of the beginning, 11th to the 13th of September. And it'll be in Connecticut, in West Hartford, Connecticut, at the Holy Family Passionist Retreat Center. Our retreat leader is going to be Father James Keenan. He's a Jesuit priest at Boston College. He founded a worldwide international network of more than 1,000 Catholic ethicists. He's extremely he's a great teacher, but he's also funny. He just gave a retreat for us for gay priests, and now he's going to give a retreat for all LGBT people and family and friends. So if you want to see more about about this retreat, go to the New Ways Ministry website. And also, I hope you come to the retreat because I will be there, and I hope to meet as many of you as I can that will be able to come. So thanks so much.
And thank you, Sister Janine and New Ways Ministry, for co-hosting this webinar tonight. I remind all of you that if you would like to offer personal greetings or comments to the presenters, stay here after the webinar is concluded, and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. So on behalf of everyone here, I offer extreme gratitude to Max and Tyler for their enlightening discussion. Good night to all.
Good night.